So, I'd like to start with a simple assertion, kind of to make you all comfortable in the room, which is we all are actually already game designers. Or at least we have been back in our childhood. Because if you think back about your childhood, I'm pretty sure you will remember tons of instances like this one in my own childhood. So this is not me, but this is how my walk back home from school looked like every day. Filled with concrete and usually pretty dreary, pretty rainy. So in order to make that walk home, which was always the same dreary walk, a little less boring, I made a game out of it. So I looked down at the concrete floor and said, oh, there are little cracks. And what if those cracks aren't just cracks in the pavement? What if what I'm walking on is a volcano? And out of these cracks there comes molten lava. And so my job now is to get home without getting burned by the lava by stepping on any of the cracks, right? And then you could vary the game around, could say, okay, now it's with time pressure because there's this lava wave behind me, so I have to run as fast as possible without stepping on any of the hot lava cracks, right? And that way, by just looking slightly differently at the very same activity and flipping it around with some artificial rules and goals, suddenly I made the dreary walk home a little less dreary. And that's not just something that all of us in everyday life certainly have experienced. That's something that then, back already in the early 1980s, when people in human-computer interaction and instructional design looked at games, people like Thomas Malone, they said, there were actually heuristics for designing enjoyable interfaces or enjoyable learning that we can draw from games when digital games popped up. Or how can we design for fun of use or phonology, right? Because scientists need an ology, so they put ology behind it. Right, so there was this insight already popping up in the 80s and then the 90s again that you can learn how to make something more enjoyable by looking at how games make activities enjoyable. And most recently, we've seen a surge of interest in this kind of idea under the label of gamification, right? If you look into the classic Google Trends display, you can see that traditionally people would have talked about this as persuasive technology. How do I get people to do things I want them to do? Or serious games, as we've heard. And then around 2010, suddenly this term gamification popped up in the discourse and overtook all of them in terms of search interest. One way of defining this idea is basically that, well, games is a sort of crunchy flakes or monosodium glutamate that you can sprinkle on other stuff in order to make it more enjoyable. A slightly less tongue-in-cheek understanding of it, it would be the use of game design elements in non-game context, usually in order to make those contexts more enjoyable. And I don't know about you, but if you sort of listen into the public mind and the public discourse about this idea that we can learn stuff from games for education, then usually what I see, kind of the predominant use case that I see is essentially, well, what we're talking about are MOOCs, right? And MOOCs with badges, and that we see with Khan Academy, so problem solved. And the great thing about this, MOOCs with badges to motivate people to participate in our MOOCs, is they're so deliciously scalable because we can get rid of all the teachers, right? The students can do all of that themselves, and we get all of these learning analytics for free just by the students engaging with this stuff. Wonderful, right? Well, in terms, MOOCs with badges is very, very, very old wine in new wine backs. Because essentially what it is, it combines frontal teaching, which is surely the single worst instructional method, with gold stars, which is most assuredly the single worst way of motivating learning by rewarding students for doing it. Or in the wonderful words of Peter F. Drucker, for any of the higher education managers in the room, if you need assurance, there is surely nothing quite so useless as doing with great efficiency what should not be done at all. And to a certain extent, gamified MOOCs are exactly that. They're wonderfully scalable and efficient, but they're absolutely the worst thing to do around learning. Why do we do this then, right? Why do we talk about gamification and gamified MOOCs and stuff like that? And again, if you listen into the public discourse, I think the underlying reason for that is that people have a certain folk theory about what makes things fun and what makes games fun. And this folk theory, unfortunately, is a very broken folk theory. And if you ask people, what's your theory about what makes games fun and how we can apply that to other areas, then usually at some point this person will pop up. Somebody will quote Mary Poppins, right? Somebody will quote some line of Mary Poppins and say, well, as Mary Poppins, right? This is how it works. But actually, if you really watch the movies, there's an interesting thing. In the movie of Mary Poppins, there were two conflicting theories of what is fun and how you can make something fun. And the first one is the standard folk theory of gamification, and the second one is an interesting alternative. So, onto my second bit. What is fun? What are these theories of fun that people typically have about games in everyday life? So let's look at the first theory that I'm sure everybody of you will be familiar with. Just a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. This is basically, right, if you take this literally, it means fun is a sort of additive substance, right? In the same way that you have cornflakes and milks and you don't like them, so you add a spoon of sugar and suddenly you like the cornflakes or you like the bitter medicine. And if you think a bit deeper about what this says, that fun is an additive substance in a weird way, what you're basically saying is that there is some stuff or some activities that are inherently fun, like a swing, and there is some stuff that inherently isn't fun, like learning, and so therefore you have to add fun stuff to non-fun stuff for more fun. So if we could only put swings in the classroom, all our worries would be solved. And this is not just a folk theory. If you look at it, this is basically the underlying theory of early 1990s edutainment, right? Spelling tests are horrible because they're inherently not fun, but cartoon noises and characters are inherently fun. So if you just add cartoon characters and noises to our spelling tests, suddenly our kids will love them. Or it's the kind of philosophy that underlies early serious games as well, like this wonderful about financial literacy, Financial Soccer, which is a regular soccer game where you literally sit in front of your console and you just play it with your controller, and then when you try and score a goal, before the goal scores, suddenly up pops a multiple choice questionnaire asking you, checking account overdraft protection, A, covers transactions when your account is insufficient fund, B, can be tied to your savings account, C, generally has a fee for the service, D, all of the above. Right, so it's this idea, well, yeah, this is unfun, but this is fun, so if we just add this to this, fun will ensue. And there's been lots of research around that basically saying that this idea is a resounding failure. So much so that in the educational gaming landscape, we have a derivative term for that coined by Amy Brookman in 1999. We call it chocolate-covered broccoli. Right? The idea that only if you add the sugar, the chocolate to the broccoli, surely the broccoli will be delicious. But if that's the case, then it doesn't really bode well for this idea that we can just take certain elements from games that are somehow inherently fun and just drop them onto something else and boom, fun ensues. But Mary Poppins to the rescue, there is a second theory. In every job that must be done, there is an element of fun. That is, in every activity that you look at, there is something, a seed for something potentially enjoyable, if you set up the whole system, the whole experience in a way that that comes to the fore, right? My favorite example for that are parkour practitioners. So if you don't know parkour, it's basically this thing that emerged in the Parisian suburbs in the banlieues where people said, well, we'll look at this concrete wasteland in which we're sitting and we're actually watching these kind of buildings and developing a new kind of artistic sport like capoeira, how we can use all the concrete walls and stairs, etc., as basically jumping off point for incredible acrobatics. And if you haven't seen it, just Google parkour and watch some of the videos and see what you do. So basically what you see there is that where we see a concrete wall that blocks our way, a parkour person, a trained parkour person would look at it and say, wow, that's a brilliant flip-flop opportunity, right? And again, I'm super thankful that Bernie talked about playfulness and Nicole talked about play, because one important part of that is this switch of mindset, right? So this switch to look at something and say, okay, here's an interesting challenge that I'm willing to voluntarily tackle and toy around with and play with and see what happens with it. So that mind shift is one essential part in order to bring this emergent quality in the total situation to the fore. The other part, and that is the part that we as designers can do, is to organize the activity so that that quality comes more to the fore. Right? And from that point of view, it's not that some stuff is inherently fun and some stuff inherently isn't. It's just some stuff is better designed and approached in such a way that fun is more likely and others isn't. So every activity, including learning, can become fun and interesting if you approach it in the right way and if you design it in the right way. Fun is just another word for learning. At which point this talk gets a bit circular. But Right? And you look at it and you say, well, that's a bit counterintuitive because learning, usually school usually not fun. So what do you mean? So he unpacks it further and says, the fun from gameplay arises out of mastery, out of comprehension. Basically, what he says is games are machines purpose-built to put challenges in front of our way that we try to tackle and overcome, and the satisfaction, the fist bump moment that we get when we actually overcome that challenge, when we beat the monster, when we solve the puzzle, when we jump the chasm, when we convince the non-player character to let us through, that experience of competence, of mastery, is the chief engine of enjoyment in games. It's basically this moment between the tension and suspense when you're sitting there with your tongue clenched and your fist not knowing, oh, am I going to make it or not? And then the happy resolution when you finally make it. And the interesting thing is that this is not just a practitioner theory. This overlaps very well with, right now I would say, the most well-established theory about intrinsic motivation, which is why are we doing things for their own sake and not for the sake of some consequence outside of them, which is self-determination theory. Self-determination theory says, established in thousands of studies, literally thousands of studies, that just as we have innate physiological needs like hunger or thirst or sleep, we have innate psychological needs in order to flourish as human beings. And these basic psychological needs are an experience of competence, of seeing our ability and our growing ability to affect change in the world. That is what Kosters talk about learning or mastery. Of autonomy, of having the sense that I act in congruence with my own goals and values and identity, that I'm the master of my own action. And finally, of relatedness, of being support and supporting others, of being connected deeply with other people. Right? And then, indeed, if you look into the media psychological research of maybe the last 5 to 7 years or so, you found study after study after study saying, yes, a chief source of enjoyment in games is the experience of competence that arises from overcoming challenges. So if we know that, so if we say, okay, fun in games comes out of overcoming challenges, how do we then apply that to a redesigning learning method? And here, I take my cue from the wonderful Margaret Robertson, game designer, who early on about gamification said, it's basically an inadvertent con because it tricks people into believing that there is a simple way to imbue your thing with the psychological, emotional, social power of a great game. It is a just add to a certain point. And I would argue it isn't. And just to make that point, here are a couple of games, semi-randomly culled from Metacritic, a bit meta-platform about all kinds of game feedback and game reviews. And I'll just read you some of the reviews of those games. So we have Elf Bowling 1 and 2. For this reason, I think game developers should have at least 3 years in video game experience. They should be hung like a piñata and beaten. We have NRA Varmint Hunter. All the thrill of the hunt, without the thrill or the hunt. We have Balls of Fury. They should have just called it Balls because they certainly had some while they were making this game. We have Big Rigs Over the Road Racing. This game, and I use the term loosely, is so pathetic it makes a sandpaper and vinegar enema sound positively delightful, not that I would know. And Little Britain, the video game, pray for an end to cash and greed and weep for the death of quality. There shall now be a paragraph's silence. Which is just another way of saying 90% of everything is crud, including games. Games are not fun because they are games. Games are fun when they are well designed. So how do you apply that, then, to instructional design? Well, the fundamental lesson is that how something feels, the experience that arises from something, is not something you can predetermine on a planning table. It's impossible because it's an emergent quality. So what you have to do is you have to get something out there so that people can actually play it, or they can actually experience your classroom or your learning activity, how it would play out, and then see how it feels, evaluate why it feels the way it feels, and based on that, make adjustment. Which is, if you want an academic mouthful, iterative experiential prototyping and testing. The more loops you go through that, the more loops you go through, let's put something that people can actually experience and play and do out there, see how it feels, see why it feels, and change and change and change and change, the more you get to something that actually approaches a fun activity. So to summarize, if you want to design for gameful experience, for the kind of fun and enjoyment that you get when you play a well-designed game. You shouldn't sugarcoat non-fun stuff. Rather, you should try and find an interesting challenge inherent in the thing you try to teach. You should structure it well and playtest and iterate until you get it right. Thank you.